Hello, welcome to this audio-visual experience, the purpose of which is to go a little bit deeper into a topic that we touched upon very briefly in one of our synchronous sessions. And that topic is the two primary ways in which you will usually construct a compare and contrast essay of the kind that you are currently working on and the kind that you will be working on for the final. So it might give you some things to think about that might be helpful as you, over the last couple of days of revising your paper number 3, that compare and contrast argumentative essay. But it should definitely give you some things to think about as you go into the final and prepare to write that final essay, which will again be a compare and contrast essay. But also to give you some things to think about when writing not just compare and contrast papers in the future, any kind of paper, to really give as much thought to the way that you are arranging your ideas. All right. So it's not just the ideas that are themselves that are being presented that lend impact to a solid paper. It's also the way those ideas are arranged, presented, oriented in relation to one another. And there's always choice, and the choices that you make in this matter of structure are important, for better or worse, right? That is, the choices you make might be conducive towards a more persuasive argumentative essay, a more convincing argumentative essay, a more engaging paper, whether it's an argumentative essay or a research paper, anything. The choices that you make inform the meaning of what you are writing, right? So it's not just what the words themselves directly mean. There's emotional resonance that builds up through the way those words are arranged. There's associative resonance that builds up through the way those words are arranged, not just on the level of the sentence, but also on the level of the paragraph and the paper as a whole, the text as a whole. Right, so even though this little presentation is mainly about compare and contrast essays, the bigger takeaway that I want you to get from this is that structure, the overarching structure of a paper of any kind or anything that you are writing, is of almost equal importance as the direct meaning of the ideas that you're putting down on the paper, right? If they're arranged in some kind of incomprehensible manner, then it doesn't really matter what they mean because the reader isn't going to really grasp onto anything. So you want to create a structure that allows the meaning that gives the thoughts put into writing some kind of significance in relation to each other thought that is put into that paper or whatever kind of text you are composing. So let's have a look, shall we, at this little presentation I put together, which I will also post independently on Blackboard, but these things are meant to have a commentary attending them, so it won't do you as much good to just look at the PowerPoint. All right, so as I just stated, this is a presentation about the two primary ways to structure a compare and contrast essay. Right. Now it's important to remember that there are no hard and easy guidelines, to follow when writing anything. You don't want to fall into the trap of just abiding by some formula. You want to make intuitive decisions based on the material that you're writing about, right? You want to create a form that suits the content rather than trying to force the content into some pre-established model that will somehow take away from the impact of the content or begin to obscure the greater representative value of the content. But that being said, these are kind of two primary general structures that you can use and sort of adapt to your own purposes, depending on what you're writing about, the argument you're making. These are generally pretty effective and common forms of writing the compare and contrast essay. But of course, you know, especially when you get into writing longer papers, you might be doing you know, variations on these, mingling these two together, mingling these kinds of structures. For our most immediate purposes, these are the two ways that will be most effective to you, and whatever sort of argument you're making, especially in the final or whatever you might be finishing up on with your second draft of your paper number 3. All right, so the first way we're going to talk about of how to structure a compare and contrast essay is the subject by subject model. And the subject by subject model means that it means you do a whole section first. You begin by saying everything you have to say about the first subject you are discussing. Then you move on and you make all the points you want to make about the second subject. Right. And by the way, a lot of this information is also just taken from that handout that I put in a weekly folder a couple weeks ago. So you can look back at that for further guidance and advice about how to write compare and contrast essays. And that there's more there than just the structure as well. Most of it's stuff we talked about already, but it's also just really effective, and it's good to consult your references, whatever they may be, right? So again, begin by saying everything. This is a subject by subject model. Begin by saying everything you have to say about the first subject you are discussing. Then move on and make all the points you want to make about the second subject. And you might be writing about more than two things, right? You can write a compare and contrast essay about more than two texts, more than two items, whatever. It doesn't have to be limited to two. But of course, you are currently writing about two texts, and for the final, you'll be writing about just two texts. But yeah, so that's the model. So you write about your first subject. In our case, it would be your first text, and then you move on to the second text and say everything you want to say about the second text. If the paper is short, you might be able to fit all of your paragraphs about each item into a single paragraph. But it's more likely that you'd have several paragraphs per item, and definitely recommended. You probably want to have just 4 paragraphs, even on the relatively short papers that you're writing. You want to break those paragraphs up according to sort of the finer points about each text, right? And you still want to find a way. You probably, even if you're going to have just 1 paragraph about the first text and just 1 paragraph about the second text, you'd still want at least another body paragraph to really bring the texts into direct contact with one another, so that you're really tying it together in some way through the ways that we've talked about, either through in a complementary way or in an oppositional way. Right, so for each of these models that we're talking about today, I've created a little sample outline for each of the structural models that we're talking about today. So for the subject by subject model, let's say that you were writing a paper about the symbolism of fruit motifs in a book called Paradise, which, by the way, is not an actual book. None of this exists anywhere. It's a riff off of something that I wrote in a response to one of you concerning your own paper, and I kind of enjoyed the idea, so I ran with it. Right, so this is not a book that exists. Bear that in mind. I just made this up as I went, but that's beside the point. Let's say that you were writing a paper about the symbolism of fruit motifs in a book called Paradise, which takes place on an apple orchard in Maine, and is about a girl named Eva who dreams of Florida as a paradise to which she may one day escape from her oppressively religious family. Let's say that you wanted to make an argument about the parallels in the story between apples and oranges. Sound familiar? You might have a thesis about how apples, because of their associations with the fall of man and the exile from Eden in the Bible, symbolize disgrace and loss, while oranges represent hope and liberation, which by association makes the dream of Florida into an Edenistic vision of unattainable paradise. Right? So obviously this isn't a fully formed thesis, but you can see how it might be developed into something that goes beyond just a statement of saying that in the book Paradise, there are a variety of similarities and differences between the motifs of the apples and the oranges that run throughout the whole work, or something like that, right? It's taking it a step farther. It's getting at the significations of it, getting at the meaning, the representational value. It's interpreting those motifs in the book, those symbols, those objects. And also take note, right, that this is, if you were writing this, it's about one text. So compare and contrast doesn't always mean comparing and contrasting two texts. In this instance, you would be comparing and contrasting two different symbols from the same text. So you're only working with one text. You could do it with characters, you could do it with different settings in the same text. And again, you don't always have to be confined to text. You can do this. This is a mode of thinking, a mode of analysis that can be applied to all kinds of things, from products to politicians to, poems, songs, movies, animals, and anything, right? It's a method of analysis. So it's a really transferable skill, and it goes beyond just writing papers for English 1010, right? It has a lot of real world value. Right, so if you were going to be writing this paper using the subject by subject model, which would probably be the best choice in this case, you'd want to say, you'd want to go into a full discussion of the apples in the novel, right? You'd want to talk about the association with the fruit of knowledge in Genesis, recounting of the story of Adam and Eve by Eva's father. So again, I'm just making this up. There's no actual story that this is referring to. But you could easily see how, I hope you could easily see how this is, nonetheless, it's referring to particular instances in the text, in this imaginary text. And you might talk about Eva's father in the confines of the apple orchard. And then you might talk about a particular occurrence of the apple in this story, where it ties together this, the story of Genesis, the religious connotations of it, the religious associations, which, if this is a story about an oppressively religious family, then the religious associations and connections might be really overt, right? They might be really on the surface. But then perhaps maybe hidden a bit beneath the surface are some related experiences of this girl's father and her family. So you might talk about the apple orchard and how it represents a certain emotional state of Eva's father. And then you might tie that all together with a particular occurrence of apple in the story, right? And so you probably wouldn't want to try to do all this in one paragraph. You can tell by the breakdown this would probably be 3 paragraphs. But you'd handle it all together, right? You'd do these 3 paragraphs about the apples and this story. You'd cover them in succession before moving on to the next subject. Hence the subject by subject model. So after you've talked extensively about the representational value of the apples and the connection to Genesis and Adam and Eve and all that in this story, then you move on to the oranges in this story. And let's say that the oranges, if the apples in this story have kind of an overt meaning, where the apples are directly connected to the story of Genesis and the themes that are represented by the story of Adam and Eve and the exile from the garden and all that. Let's say that the oranges are a little bit less obvious. let's say that that oranges keep popping up in orange juice, say, right? Let's just say that this theme of, or this motif of oranges keeps popping up throughout this novel. And when you read it, you notice that every time oranges appear, they're somehow connected to, uh, it somehow leads into digressions or flashbacks or flash forwards or something, or it goes down this side avenue. And you notice that every time it does that, oranges are present. So you might begin to realize that the oranges, even though it's not overt and clearly stated, that the oranges also have some kind of symbolic value in the way that the apples obviously do. Um, so once you've decided what that representational value is, and you've gotten to the point where you're actually writing an argumentative essay about it, then you might talk about patterns of occurrence and oranges in the story, right? So you begin to set up, you begin to establish the framework of this part of your argument, right? That every time the oranges appear in the story, Eva, the narrator, goes into a digression that departs from the central narrative in a way. And then from that you realize that Eva has expressed dreams of running away to Florida. Eva, the narrator, she wants to escape her oppressive family. And you realize that oranges are directly connected with Florida, and that's, beyond the text. Oranges are commonly associated with Florida, right? Real Florida oranges, orange juice on ice. So it's sort of pre-established connotations that extend beyond the text. And then the parallels with the oranges in connection to Florida, you see that there are parallels of apples and their connection to the Garden of Eden. And the conclusion that you draw from all of this is that the parallels of apples and oranges in this story, Paradise, makes Florida into a symbol of unattainable paradise, right? So you're dealing with this sort of succession of representation. In this story, you'd be starting with apples, which are obvious, and then oranges, which are a little less obvious. And then finally, you'd be making this connection through this otherwise seemingly trivial, perhaps this seemingly trivial connection. You'd be making this broader, more important connection of the Florida that Eva imagines as being equal to this kind of Eden that in itself represents her father's fall from grace or what have you. Whatever, on and on. The actual plot of this non-existing novel is not really important. The important thing is that you would be talking about the apples in their entirety and the oranges in their entirety. And this would probably be the oranges, again, it wouldn't be a one paragraph. You'd probably devote at least 3 paragraphs to this. And this C, what's represented by C, would probably be a somewhat larger paragraph, because that's where you'd be pulling everything together. And in that sense, this isn't really a great outline. But the point is to show how the paper is divided in this way. But you'd want to have this substantial paragraph in which you make your final connections of the apples and the oranges motifs in the story, and then how that makes a larger connection, a larger parallel of Florida to Eden, and a kind of idea of an unattainable paradise or whatever, right? So you have this point of divide. You talk about the apples sort of exclusively, and then you talk about the oranges exclusively, and then you lead up into making the connections from the apples to the oranges, and how that creates larger and more complex symbolism and signification and representational value. So when the subject by subject model is usually most effective is when you're doing what might be called a lens comparison. And that's when one subject or item is used to better understand another item. And you can see how that works with this present example, right? The apples are the lens. They're, for our purposes here, we're saying that the meaning of the apples, the representational value of the apples, the symbolism of the apples in the story is sort of really clearly established, that there are clear connections made to the story of Genesis in those themes. Whereas the oranges were saying the symbolic value is a little bit more subdued, a little bit more hidden, a little bit more enmeshed in the regular, surface meaning, right? It's a little bit more hidden. But we're using the clearer and more obvious meaning of the apples through establishing that dynamic and those connections. It allows us to understand better the meaning of the oranges, right? By looking through this relationship, we can find parallels to this more covert series of relationships. We can understand this series of relationships better. We can pull that out and find the meaning by looking through the lens of the apples, right? So we're using one topic to better understand another. And that's why I fully, creating a firmly establishing the symbolic relationships of the apples to the characters and setting in the story and to these themes, we can sort of look through our lens and better understand these these subtler symbolic relationships. But beware, the danger of this subject by subject organization is that your paper might simply be a list of points, and this is always an issue, and it's an issue that I saw in a number of papers that strove to do this kind of subject by subject structure. It's this resulting in a certain number of points about one subject, then a certain number of points about another, but then not actually making any connection, right? It should be more than just a pair of lists juxtaposed against each other. And it also oftentimes ends up listing irrelevant differences, or like things that are so obviously different that they don't even matter. So for example, let's say that you were writing about Cormac Cullinan's If Nature Had Rights and David Foster Wallace's Consider the Lobster. And if one of the things that you point out as a difference, as one of the main constructive differences of your essay, is that Cullinan never mentions lobsters, whereas David Foster Wallace's piece is all about lobsters. Yeah, obviously that's a difference, right? But when you're operating on that level, where is that actually getting us? What does that difference matter? Of course, you could do that about any text and just point out the one thing that, the different topics of the text. There's billions and billions and billions of texts in the world, and you could simply say that they're talking about two different things, but that doesn't get us anywhere. What you want to do is find the differences within the commonalities, right? The differences within the similarities, and that often becomes harder if you're just doing the subject by subject and just creating this list of, such and such article is about this, this, and this. Such and such article is about this, this, and this. They're similar and they're different because both things talk about nature, but they're different because one is about trees and one is about lobsters, right? That's not taking us across any analytical or interpretive distance, right? It's barely even taking us any distance upon the surface. You still want to have at least one body paragraph where you tie everything together, where you show why those differences and similarities that you've listed, why they matter, how they, again, how they are opposing each other when they seem to be in agreement, or how they are agreeing when they seem to be in opposition, or how they are paralleling each other in ways that aren't obvious, or how they are filling in the gaps, right? So if let's say it's if you're talking about the rights of nature, there are different ways that Wallace's text fill in the gaps that Collinan leaves, right? Collinan talks about things in a very straightforward, kind of legalistic manner, whereas David Foster Wallace is taking a more philosophical approach. He's not exactly taking a stance on the matter of nature having rights the same way that Collinan is, but he's arguing that people just don't even think about it. And you can talk about Collinan's piece as being more about the impact of structures and institutions and systems on the environment, whereas Wallace's piece is really more about individual choice or lack thereof, right? Of the individual within some kind of economic system, and how that gives cause for an individual to not really think about their choices of consumption, right? And that way they fill in the gaps more. It's not important that one is talking about trees and one is talking about lobsters. That's not an important difference. But what is an important difference is the different angles from which they're approaching the same issue, which is that of nature having rights, right? If that's what you're writing about. Of course, Consider the Lobster, I think, goes way beyond nature's rights. But if you were writing about those two texts, I'm just making an example, that's probably the point at which you want to connect, right? So they're linking up. You're seeing what the other one is missing out on its central issue, or the central issue of connection. So the second model, the second structural model we're going to cover in this is the point-by-point model. And a point-by-point structure is simply when a paper discusses the two items or subjects, in this case, in your case, texts, when discussed together in relation to a series of points of comparison handled one at a time. Now, this is what the majority of you did anyway with your paper number 3, with the compare and contrast essays that you've been working on. And for most of you, I think that was the right choice to make, with a few exceptions. And there were a few exceptions when somebody chose the subject by subject when they should have chose the point by point structure. And maybe only 1 or 2 instances of somebody choosing a point by point structure when it really probably would have been a lot more effective as a subject by subject structure. So again, just always think about this. How is the structure contributing to the impact of this paper? How are the pieces arranged to create some kind of cohesive, comprehensive whole? All right, so for the example for the point-by-point structural model, I've chosen a seasonal theme. So let's say you were writing a thesis, and this, by the way, is actually, even though if you celebrate Christmas, you're probably more familiar with the screen versions of these stories, but this is actually a valid literary argument, right? These are literary characters that we're dealing with. So let's say you were writing a literary argument about the Grinch and Ebenezer Scrooge. Dr. Seuss's The Grinch and Charles Dickens's Ebenezer Scrooge. And the thesis you were making, the argument you were making, is that although the Grinch is crimes were more directly damaging to his immediate community in a material sense, Ebenezer Scrooge's miserliness is indicative of more deeply ingrained systemic abuses and psychological toxicity, and his narrative arc therefore traces a more profound and socially impactful redemption. All right, so this would actually be a very nice compare and contrast literary argument that you could make if you were so inclined. And you'll notice that there's nowhere in here does it even say anything. Nowhere in here do you see the words similarities and differences, right? It's implicit in the construction of the thesis. And you'll also notice that this isn't necessarily, it's not saying how these two character arcs complement each other exactly. And it's sort of weighing one against the other. But it's not just a simple opposition, right? It's not just saying that Ebenezer Scrooge is a better character than the Grinch or something like that. It's more complex than that. And it's highlighting, it's underscoring this difference between the two. But it's not necessarily making a value judgment. It's not necessarily saying that one is a more effective character than the other for the context of their story. It's just saying that this is a different way to interpret the moral value of these characters, the representational value, that they're different within their context. And also you can see that you can see the main points we'd be hitting, right? We have the crimes, and it's worded differently down here, but it's the same thing, right? Ebenezer Scrooge's miserliness, that's his crimes, right? And it's making this distinction between the two crimes. And it could even be better. You could say, although the Grinch's thievery was more directly damaging to his immediate community in a material sense. Right? If you're familiar with these stories, if you celebrate Christmas and you know these stories, you'll know that the Grinch comes down from his cave on a mountain and he steals Christmas from all the Who's down in Whoville, and he steals kind of a little bit more than really. He steals everything from all of the Who's houses, right? But it's making this distinction, and we know what we're going to be talking about in this paper. Crimes, there's a distinction made between the crimes. That one is material, one is more, it is material as well. We get that from miserliness, but it's also, it's broader, it's systemic. He's part of a system that is cruel, a cruel system. And it goes beyond just a brief material detriment to the point of creating a prolonged psychological problem in his community. And so we know that we're talking about the narrative arc, and the introduction would have made it clear, as would have been clear if you know the stories anyway, that each of these stories is similar, and that it's both about they're both about these curmudgeonly, angry, greedy fellows who just loathe Christmas. They loathe everything about Christmas, and they go on this arc, this arc towards redemption, right? And we know that. So the argument here is that Scrooge's redemption is more profound and socially impactful. And through that, even though it doesn't say anything about the Grinch's redemption up here, it would have been made clear by the introduction that that's what we're talking about. But it's also implied just by making that comparison, just by saying that there is a more profound and socially impactful redemption. That implies, that strongly suggests, in such a way that it should be perfectly clear that the Grinch also goes through some kind of process, just by that construction, right? So let's look at what that might look like if you were writing this paper with the point-by-point model of construction. So we'll say that you have 2 points, right? You have the crimes and the redemption. Those are your 2 points here for this paper. You could have a lot more. You probably want to have less. If you only had 1 point, then you probably want to do the subject by subject model, unless it was a very complex singular point that could be broken down into subpoints. But anyway, for our purposes here, the two points, the 2 constructive points of this argument are the crimes and the redemption of each of these characters. So we'd break it down like this. We'd have the Grinch, who stole everything from the town of Whoville. You might mention that, to show the range of his crimes, they were illegal, they were spiteful, they were selfish. Even though I didn't put selfish here, I think it could fit. It was a one-time thing. He did this on one night. It wasn't a long habitual practice. He just stole Christmas one time. And it was only damaging in a material sense. But you might make some comment about how if he continued on, if he didn't have his redemption, his crimes could possibly eventually begun to deteriorate the psychological well-being of the Who's down in Whoville if he just began to terrorize them on a regular basis. And you also might make some mention about how he was emotionally abusive to his dog, right? If you know the story, if you've seen the cartoon, he's always yelling at his poor little dog, whipping him, making him pull a sleigh that's about 100 times its own body weight, and so on and so forth, right? So you might make mention of these things just to get the full range, right? You don't want to leave things out just because they might seem contrary to your argument. You want to include everything you can, and then logically refute it. So if this seems extensive, and these crimes seem especially substantial, you want to make an extra effort to show how this Scrooge's crimes are even deeper and more substantial, right? But that's how you start, right? So we're talking about the crimes. That's the first point, and you talk about the Grinch, and in relation to those crimes, this might be a paragraph. This might be its own paragraph, but more likely it would be 1, A and B would be its own paragraph, and then 2 and 3 would be another paragraph, right? So you can see we're already up to a couple of paragraphs. All right, so this would be after the introduction, by the way, after the thesis paragraph. Then you'd go into this. There would be an article, there would be a paragraph about the Grinch's crimes, and then another paragraph about the Grinch's crimes, right? So 2 paragraphs tying the subject to this particular point in this case. And then, still on the topic of crimes, you talk about Scrooge, who his crimes involved hoarding his wealth while those near to him suffered. You might say he didn't even enjoy himself, thereby not even making himself into a symbol of material hopefulness. You might add another crime, that he impeded on Bob Cratchit's freedom of religious observation and expression. He's very, if you know the story, he's the boss of Bob Cratchit, and he's very much opposed to Bob Cratchit celebrating Christmas. This is perhaps poorly worded, but Scrooge stands by while Bob Cratchit's son, Tiny Tim, who's sick, is slowly dying. And it's a habitual, sustained, and steadily corrosive to the psychological well-being of his community, these crimes, right? Which is, you might pull an illustrative reference out of the text, which after he dies, the charwoman, this cleaning woman, everybody that comes to his house after he dies, they sort of just ruthlessly plunder all of his goods, and everybody's happy that he's dead. So that shows the extremity and the psychological damage of his crimes, right? So this would probably be a paragraph where you're just sort of itemizing the extent of his crimes. And then this would probably be another paragraph where it's talking about, it's sort of analyzing them, right? So this might just sort of itemize the crimes, but then you have this paragraph wherein you would interpret the crimes on a deeper level. You'd go beyond just summarizing them into really expressing why they are more severe than the Grinch's, because that would ultimately be conducive towards building towards your larger argument, which is that Scrooge's redemption is more profound, bigger, greater, right? More intense, more severe, more dramatic. So then you can see. So you have including the introduction thesis paragraph. You would by now be up to at least 5 paragraphs, right? And then you get into the redemption. So you've talked about the Grinch, you've talked about Scrooge, and now you're back to the Grinch, right? In relation to the point of redemption, the point of comparison, that is redemption. And you give a brief breakdown of how the Grinch is moved in the moment by who's singing and gives everything back, which is what happens in the story if you don't know it. Even though the Grinch has stolen everything from all the Who's, which are these guys, these people, whatever they are, these creatures. Even though the Grinch has stolen everything from them, they still come out on Christmas morning and they're still happy because they're all together and they still have Christmas and they still have love in their hearts and they still sing. And the Grinch hears this and he's moved to bring Christmas back, to bring everything back to the people. I've never felt it was an appropriate title for this story, by the way, because he really takes a lot more than Christmas. He takes everything from them, everything that they own, everything in the bread box and the wires from the walls, even everything. But anyway, part of the argument would be that, like the Grinch's crimes, his redemption is impulsive and representative of capriciousness as much as sustained moral conversion. So I'd be arguing that it's a sort of knee-jerk reaction, that he's easily swayed by emotional jabs, right? 1 second he's angry and spiteful and envious of all the Who's enjoying their Christmas, and the next second he hears the love and he's moved by their lovely singing voices. And he sort of swings into this positivity and brings everything back, and it's Christmas, and he feels Christmas in his heart. But we have no, maybe next year he doesn't feel the same way, right? So again, this would be probably paragraph 6 and 7 in the entirety of the paper. And then you'd be back to Scrooge, right? But in reference to the second point of redemption. And you talk about how the spirits take Scrooge through a deep plunge of his psyche and expose through his personal history the pain and suffering to which he contributed throughout his personal history. So again, if you don't know this story, A Christmas Carol, Scrooge, who is a miser, he's visited by 3 ghosts on Christmas Eve going into Christmas Day, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, and they take him through his life, and he sees all the terrible things that he's done, and the horrible effects of his selfishness and all that. So he's really coming face to face with his entire self, his entire life. And upon his reformation, Scrooge sets out to compensate for not just one night, but a whole lifetime of avarice and cruelty, right? And you can see how this is setting him off against the Grinch, right? Whose crime was one night, and his redemption perhaps only lasts for one night. But it's explicit in A Christmas Carol that Scrooge goes on to become involved with the Cratchits on a personal level. He takes care of them. He makes sure that Tiny Tim gets the medical help that he needs. And he really develops he goes on to develop an experiential understanding of love, sympathy, and empathy, rather than a momentary emotional knee-jerk reaction, right? So this would be kind of paragraphs 8 and 9, I would say, 8 and 9. These would be one paragraph set up by this paragraph, right? So obviously it's not just one paragraph for the crimes and one paragraph for the redemption. or even one paragraph for the Grinch and Crimes and the Scrooge and Crimes, and then the Grinch and Redemption and the Scrooge and Redemption, which would be 4 paragraphs. But that being said, you could do that. You could do it if you had less to, if it was a different topic. If it was a different topic and you had a lot less to say about it, then you could do one paragraph that talks about the Grinch and Scrooge both together in relation to their redemption, and one paragraph that talks about them in relation to crimes. But that's if that's all that needs to be said, right? That's not to say, if there's more, if you've done that, let's say that you've done that in this particular example with this particular paper, if you were writing this, and you did just one paragraph talking about the Grinch and Scrooge in reference to redemption, that wouldn't be enough, right? Because there's more to be said. There's more to be said about it. But let's say that you were talking about, instead of crimes and redemption, the Grinch and Scrooge, let's say that you were talking about apples and oranges in relation to, you're saying, you're trying to make an argument that apples were better for a particular kind of diet, right? So in that case, you might spend a paragraph talking about the nutritional qualities of apples and oranges, just one paragraph, and then a paragraph talking about the accessibility, the relative accessibility of apples and oranges. That would be a paragraph. And then I don't know, maybe the versatility of each of the fruits, that one or the other could be used in more recipes than the other fruit, and you might talk about that as one paragraph, right? So in that case, you'd have just 3 paragraphs, or it could even be, you could have one paragraph devoted to nutrition, where you talk about apples and oranges at the same time, one paragraph devoted to the accessibility, the availability of each fruit. But then maybe you have a lot more to say about the versatility, the culinary versatility of each of the fruits. Maybe you have a lot more to say about that. In which case, you divide that 3rd paragraph up into 2 paragraphs, and you'd have 4 paragraphs altogether. Again, the form ultimately has to come down to how it suits the content. The content should determine the form. Always, always, always. There's no hard lines about how to structure an essay, ultimately. As long as it fits the argument, as long as it fits the content, the subject, and it makes sense, and it's clear, and it logically, it progresses logically, then that's how the structure should be determined. So this is the final bit here. Paragraphs for sections, which we've already kind of covered. Sections does not equate to paragraphs. One section. So let's say that the section of, if crime, and the previous paper we just discussed, if crimes is a section, that doesn't necessarily equate to one paragraph, right? Crimes as a section would be multiple paragraphs, and then the next section would be redemption, and that would be multiple paragraphs. The selection of points is really important, right? So if you're writing the paper about the imaginary story called Paradise and the apples and oranges as symbols in that, you probably wouldn't want to spend much time. You wouldn't want to spend any time talking about the nutritional value of apples and oranges in that case, right? You're only talking about the cultural connotations of those fruits. The price of those fruits probably doesn't matter. How those fruits can be used in a recipe probably doesn't matter. Even what those fruits look like probably doesn't matter, right? All that matters is the associations, the cultural associations that are set up by the novel and that are already, that the author assumes that the reader already has. And you want to order your points effectively, right? So with the Grinch and Scrooge paper, if you were writing that, it probably wouldn't make as much sense to talk about the redemption first and then talk about the crimes, right? It doesn't follow a logical progression in the same way, especially to the argument that thesis sets up. And also, if you're privileging in some way, so to speak, if you're privileging, say, Scrooge over the Grinch, you wouldn't want to end with the Grinch. You want to end with Scrooge because it's with Scrooge that you're making the finer point about. And the same goes for subject by subject, right? If the main point of that example is to bring out the subtler meaning of the oranges in that novel, and if you're trying to do that by making parallels to the clearly established meaning of the apples, it wouldn't make much sense to talk about the oranges first and then talk about the apples. You want to talk about the apples that are clearly established symbols. You'd want to talk about them so that when you get to the oranges, the parallels that you're making add up and they relate back to the firmly established points, right? So always think about how things are ordered and the final point that you're making. That's the final thing that the reader is going to see, and that's the final takeaway. So you want everything to sort of culminate in that point. It shouldn't be random. Nothing about these papers should be random. It should be carefully structured, carefully ordered, carefully thought out to achieve the full impact, right? All right, so with that, I shall bid you a good night and good luck with the final stages of this semester.